Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So today we're continuing our special focus on Russia and Ukraine. Last time we were here with Dr. Weber, Russian President Vladimir Putin had just recognized the People's Republics, so-called, of Luhansk and Donetsk, delivered a speech filled with historical myths and grievances, and the nation of Belarus had announced that the Russian military units there for exercises were not, in fact, leaving as planned. Only a few days later, Russia launched its long-feared invasion of Ukraine, attacking from multiple directions, bombarding cities with missile and artillery strikes, and causing a humanitarian crisis that now stands at over 1 million refugees having fled Ukraine, with more persons displaced internally. To tell us where things stand and what more might unfold, we welcome two of our Krulak Center Fellows to this program. We have first Dr. Yuval Weber, who, if you were here last week, you saw him. He's one of our distinguished fellows here at the Krulak Center. He's a research assistant professor at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C. Prior to coming to Texas A&M, Dr. Weber served as the Kennan Institute Associate Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School, as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Government at Harvard University, and as an assistant professor in the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Dr. Weber has held research positions at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and the Carnegie Moscow Center. He's published on a range of Russian and Eurasian security, political, and economic topics in academic journals and for the popular press in the United States and Russia. We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Rosella Cappella Zielinski, who is one of our non-resident fellows. She's an associate professor of political science at Boston University, specializing in the study of political economy and security. Her book, How States Pay for Wars, published by Cornell University Press in 2016, won the 2017 American Political Science Association Robert L. Jervis and Paul W. Schroeder Best Book Award in International History and Politics. Her other works can be found in Conflict Management and Peace Science, the European Journal of International Relations, the Journal of Global Security Studies, the Journal of Peace Research and Security Studies, as well as Foreign Affairs, the Texas National Security Review, and War on the Rocks. She, in addition to being one of our non-resident fellows, she's also affiliated with the Cost of Wars Project. In addition to her academic research, she's committed to promoting the study of political economy of national security. She is the founder and co-director of Boston University's Project for the Political Economy of Security, and teaches classes in international relations, emphasizing national security. Her courses explore the politics of paying for defense, international conflict, nuclear security, with the support from the Stanton Foundation, the relationship between war and society, and a variety of other issues in the field of international relations. So to both of you, we're very happy to have you here. I appreciate you coming in on relatively short notice, and I will turn it over to the both of you to tell us what's going on.
Okay, thank you, Major Brown, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your days in order to be with us. I have a sort of full presentation that I've prepared, but I won't be going in detail into each one of the slides. So if anyone is interested in the actual slide deck, please get in touch. Well, I won't say my email address while we're recording, but just to make sure the trolls don't get after me, but we'll make it available to anyone who wants it. So where are we after basically one extremely intense week where we have seen the international order being changed in tremendous ways? And obviously what we can see here is the world's most dangerous grandpa endlessly ranting at all the people who make him upset on the left. The people on the right who may not be as familiar to the average person, the lady sitting in the back, that is the governor of Russia's central bank. And to our right that is the President Putin's economic advisor and formerly the Minister of Economic Development. President Putin is in one reality, they're in the reality that exists on Earth, because it's their job in order to figure out what is the economic response to the war President Putin has launched. So in last week's broadcast, I went in sort of long detail about each one of Russia's political goals, both for Ukraine and for NATO and the United States. For NATO and the US, it's basically remove all the post-Cold War, post-Soviet expansion. That's for NATO, in essence, to cancel itself. Guarantee no new members, specifically Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, anybody else. Halt all activities in former Soviet Union, which includes the Baltic states, which are NATO members, and remove nuclear weapons from Europe. Obviously, all of these are non-starters from the get-go. And when the Russians started with this in November of last year, it was clear at that point that war was an extreme possibility. Now, for Ukraine, and one of these things is bold, and that's what I'd like to focus in for just a minute or two, is they want, obviously the Russians want all their territorial revisions to be accepted. So the norm against trying to take, the provinces from the neighbors, they want the Ukrainians to agree to that. They want them to agree to demilitarization, which means any weapons that Ukraine may have to defend itself against Russia, they want those gone. But one of the things that we've heard a lot about in recent days, weeks, is when Sergei Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russia, pictured there, is that Ukraine must undergo a complete denazification, which obviously means a regime change for anyone who entered politics from the Euromaidan events of 2014 through the present. Now, this is a pretty crazy charge. Are there, crazy, neo-Nazis or Nazis running around in Kiev ruling the country? Obviously, the answer is no. But it's important to understand both in terms of the signaling the Russians do towards their own population and how the Ukrainians have responded, is to help us understand why both sides are so devoted to basically not just like winning this particular conflict, but how each side has read or misread international public opinion, which has led to, in effect, the world coming to Ukraine's side. So for the Russians, and I used to live in Russia for a number of years, and so this is something that is perhaps one of the most deeply held aspects of both contemporary Russian culture, but really Soviet culture going back to the experience of World War II. Now, obviously, the actual Nazis, the Germans of those days, invaded the Soviet Union. Of course, they started by bombing Kiev at 4 in the morning. This Russian war started at 5 in the morning with the bombing of Kiev. So when the Germans came in, obviously, they're bad. They came, they destroyed things, and eventually the Soviet Union was able to stop them at Stalingrad, which I'll mention again in a second, and then basically push them back. And so we understand that for the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were not able to build the communism that they wanted, the key sort of origin of the Soviet identity was not the revolution and the Civil War and, those eras of the 20s and the 30s, but it became over time the successful victory over Germany in World War II. And when they talk about World War II, they don't talk about, the invasion of Poland in 1939. They talk about the invasion of Germany into the Soviet Union in 1941. Their Great Patriotic War, 41 to 45, is something that led to the deaths of 20 million Soviet citizens. Every single family has someone who lost somebody in the fighting, in the blockade of Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, or, we can go into many different directions. The defense of Moscow, where my own relatives died, middle-aged people and civilian citizen militias. So in that sense, everyone who opposed, so the Nazis attacked the Soviets. And so what the Russians are saying now is anyone who attacks us is a Nazi, because anyone who attacks the Soviet Union, and since we're the successors to the Soviet Union as Russians, that anyone who's against us is a Nazi. And so therefore, anyone who opposes us in a political sense is a Nazi, and therefore needs to be eliminated from the political scene altogether. So that's what the Nazi sort of reference comes to. Now, how have the Ukrainians responded to this? And this really goes into the way the Ukrainians have organized not just the resilience, the defense of their own homeland, but how do they start to think of themselves in terms of being a people in opposition to the Russians? So there's a town in the middle of, on the Dnieper River called Dnipro, and the mayor of that town said, we're going to turn our city into Stalingrad. Now, when we hear the word Stalingrad, we think this was a futile, operation, to take the city that had Stalin's name, and this was what led to the beginning of the end for the Germans. From the Soviet perspective, and now in terms of what is the Russian-Ukrainian perspective, what the Stalingrad means as a symbol, never mind the history, but as a symbol, it means that this is the place where the Soviet army took a stand, martyred itself, and beat back the enemy. So as the West was dithering about opening a second front, the Soviet army, the Red Army, was able to stop the German advance, stop the advance of the invaders. So by using this Stalingrad imagery, what that particular mayor is doing is attending to this, signaling the message to both his own people, we are going to stop the enemy here, we're going to stop their advance. He's saying to the Russian people, actually, you're the invaders, you're the bad guys, because it's a symbol that everyone understands. And to thus turn these images about World War II on their head. And so when President Zielinski, who's a Jewish person, says, how can I be a Nazi if I'm a Jewish person? He's appealing to the West, this is your moment not to be silent, appealing to what happened in the Holocaust. They're bringing together on the Ukrainian side language and imagery that appeals to the outside world, Ukrainian citizens, and Russian citizens, and using that in order to create the myths of national origin in real time on social media for all to experience simultaneously. And in that sense, one of the other aspects of the Soviet imagery that basically Russians obviously still love is that, the whole story of the war was the story of simple, ordinary people doing absolutely extraordinary things for the collective good. By Putin and his people calling this a special military operation instead of a war, they eliminate the ability for themselves to access these hero myths. Whereas, we have a lot of these images that we now know from the Ukrainian side. Russian military warship, take a hike. They use much more direct language. The sapper who didn't have time to evacuate after mining a bridge and blew himself up in order to prevent the advance of the Russian soldiers. So the Ukrainians are able to take direct symbols and the motifs of the Second War and turn them against the Russians. And so that's how part of what we understand in terms of worldwide political opinion, the Russians have completely discredited themselves and don't have the mechanisms to articulate their claims, and the Ukrainians do. So that wanted to help us understand why this war has gone so poorly in terms of information from the Russian side. And obviously, President Zielinski is pretty good at talking to people, and President Putin is not. So again, major military objectives. The Russians wanted to force surrender. They wanted to encircle major cities. They wanted to create a land bridge in order to capture the Sea of Azov. But they made completely wrong political assumptions about particularly the resilience and the resistance of the locals. And one of the things that we saw at the beginning of the conflict was they sent in basically the paratroopers. The paratroopers, I was looking up, when was the last time they were, the first forces into the fighting? 1956 Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia. They're only sent in as the initial force if they're not expecting widespread resistance. They're only going there when they anticipate disorganized mutiny. So instead of having the assumption that this is going to be a big fight, they went on the political assumption that basically matched Putin's rhetoric, not the reality on the ground. So, of course, the Russian army, which then had to basically chase the paratroopers, didn't have the logistics in place in order to conduct the fight that they would otherwise be capable of doing, and what many analysts, both inside and outside Russia, were anticipating. So where are we right now in terms of the security issues is a question of who rearms first. Are the Russians going to be able to reassess and basically resupply their troops more quickly than the Ukrainians from their own territory versus what the Ukrainians can do from the West? And in that sense, we had a sea change. Truly, my adult life has been built on the idea that Germany will never spend 2% of GDP on defense. But what President Putin has been able to do is, in a sense, Finland begins parliamentary debate on NATO membership. Sweden breaks its official neutrality policy. But what Putin was able to do is he ended roughly half a century of German policy. For Germany, the idea of Europe was inextricably tied to the idea of pacifism, that because their nationalism had caused 2 world wars, in order to be a European pillar, a European state, they had to constrain themselves. What Putin revealed is that by being a threat to European stability, and the Europeans clearly looked at Ukraine as a security interest because it helped protect them from Europe, is that what Putin did was put in the mind of Olaf Scholz is that to be a European state, Europe needs to be able to defend Europe instead of being a state that stays outside of active foreign and security policies. This is a new era that we're in. The post-Cold War era is over. And so the things that he's done is something that was unthinkable since 1945. Spending at this point immediate 100 billion euros for military modernization, 2% GDP spending to be enshrined in the Constitution, constructing 2 liquefied natural gas terminals, and substituting Russian gas for coal and renewables, and permitting the German army to go into NATO's eastern flank. We are in a different world altogether. The economic situation, we've heard a lot about sanctions in recent days. Those are people who are standing outside an ATM. In the first weekend after the fighting began, $10 billion in cash was withdrawn from Russian ATMs. That's the level of panic that came in immediately. And I would say that's me looking like a goof on TV. But what have we seen in terms of the sanctions regime? Quite literally everything at this point. From personal sanctions, Nord Stream 2, banks, SWIFT expulsion, sovereign debt restrictions, insurance companies being sanctioned. So the cost of doing business in Russia, it has escalated to a crazy amount, if anyone wanted to do so. Semiconductor export controls, which means anything with a chip, basically because either everything is produced in the United States or uses US technology. At the beginning of the conflict, I said, this is going to challenge Russia's ability to advance as a modern economy. The key step that very few people were able to talk or were able to consider is that the Central Bank of Russia, Ministry of Finance, and National Wealth Fund being sanctioned, that means that Russia doesn't have access to about half of its cash abroad. That is another sea change in economic warfare, which Dr. Cappella Zielinski will be discussing very shortly. Russian deglobalization, basically the world has given up on Russia. The impact on the consumer and investor, we are about to see hyperinflation. There's no bad thing that's not going to happen to Russia very shortly. This is going to be 1990s type bedlam or worse. What's about to happen in the next few steps? Starting Wednesday, there have been numerous reports that martial law will be imposed tomorrow. That means military censorship of information, closed borders, and general mobilization of men 18 to 55. And we've already started to see a few of the elements of that. Opposition radio and TV have been closed and their internet sites blocked. The Georgia land border has been closed. A plane, because the aviation industry has been sanctioned, a plane was seized in Armenia, and thereafter there were reports, which I confirmed personally, of flights being turned back from leaving the country cancellation of international flights, basically everywhere else. There's more than 1 million people who have left Ukraine in terms of the humanitarian situation. The International Criminal Court has opened proceedings on war crimes in Ukraine after 38 countries, a record, referred specific allegations. The China-backed, basically World Bank competitor, suspended activities and lending to Russia and Belarus, and the Paralympic Games in Beijing banned those same athletes. China is now essentially allowing the things that touch the outside world to go the way of sanctions against Russia. And 2 ships from flagged of Bangladesh and Estonia were attacked, and an Estonian flagged ship was sunk. Let me wind down because I'm already going over. The status quo, like what are the endgame scenarios here? Putin has spent 20 plus years, but particularly the last 10, locking down his entire society to prevent revolution, to prevent coup. That's about to be tested. This can go on for years, by the way, because Russia can just use more violence against Ukraine far faster than the Ukrainians can rearm. But the status quo means that Russia is going to be an international pariah state and use total violence against Ukraine to impose defeat. The economy and society will be set back years, decades, perhaps even generations. If there's an unsuccessful leadership challenge, i.e. a coup, we can add violence to domestic repression. If there's a successful leadership challenge, that might be in a sense even worse, because the social order will break down as the fight within the political elite, their physical safety, their political power, their wealth redistribution will be challenged. So it'll be a fight of all against all at the top. Additional tools that can be used is basically closing the existing loopholes, sanctioning actual oil and gas exports. But as Rosella might mention, at this point, very few private oil traders are actually buying Russian oil. And obviously what the West can do is acknowledge that the next Russian leader will regain access to frozen reserves abroad, meaning there is a $300 billion prize to the next winner. Some of that may go to Ukraine as reparations, but some of that will go back to Russia. And that next person will have a gigantic slush fund in order to shape the elite to his or her interests. And with that, let me turn it back to Major Brown.
All right, Dr. Weber, thank you very much. Dr. Cappella, Zielinski, go ahead and I'll just make sure your slides work because we had a little problem there, but I think we fixed it.
All right. Slides looking okay?
Yep, look good from here.
Okay. Thank you all for having me. I'm pretty sure I'm going to match Yuval's tenor and tone in terms of overwhelming awe of what's happening in many unprecedented events. So I'm going to talk specifically about war finance for both Russia and Ukraine. And again, this is all caveated that we're 1 week in. But how have and will Ukraine and Russia pay for and continue to pay for their respective war finance efforts? And the implications of this are vast, relating to how each side is going to secure continuing war inputs, citizens, the ability of citizens to go about their daily lives, and you've all just touched on that, and public opinion in both countries and abroad, and the respective stability of each of their economies. And to be clear, money can lose a war, but it cannot win one. So no matter what we're going to throw at the Ukrainians, we as in the West, that's only going to get them so far. So I take what I say with that in mind as well. And throughout my talk, I'm going to try to pepper in what I've seen as new, because there's a lot of novel things going on. I mean, I've studied 200 years of war finance. So when I say new, I am a little bit mind blown as these events unfold. So I'm going to just do 2 quick slides, kind of giving an overview of what I'm referring to when I say war finance. So first we need to just address what we're talking about. And that's really a narrower conception of what is in the cost of war. These are just the direct financial outlays to pursue military objectives. So we're not looking at pre-war armament costs, demobilization, post-war occupation, or larger structural costs related to, let's say, veterans benefits, loss of life on the state economy, or interest rates on the war debt. So war finance is the manner by which the state redirects or procures monetary resources or material to meet government outlays to execute the war effort. There are lots of ways states can finance wars, and they're all vary by differing degrees of citizen engagement with the war finance policy itself and the war, the amount of revenue to be collected and the speed at which it can be collected, and the overall economic cost of the war. And I'll touch upon this as I go through with the specifics of Russia and Ukraine. And I just want to give an overview of all of the war finance options available to Russia and Ukraine, because we need to understand the choices that are made. So from citizens, options that you can extract from your society: forced labor, we're going to make you work and not pay you for that work; forced savings plans, confiscate funds in people's bank accounts with, some promise you may pay it back; taxation, bond campaigns, general public debt, printing, austerity. So you're going to cut, let's say, cut social spending and use that money and redirect it towards the war effort; and existing coffers, a war chest, as we've been talking about with Russia. You can also finance your war from abroad: foreign debt floated largely or targeted, foreign grants, plunder, expropriation of resources. And again, all of this is leaders' choice combined with state capacity. Leaders make very specific choices on how they want to finance their war effort because they're trying to stay in power, win the war, and ensure economic stability. And because we're 1 week in, I want to stress that you finance the war you think you're going to fight. We've been seeing a lot of mill Twitter going around, for example, of saying, well, look at the logistical capacity, look at what's been sent in, and we try to get a picture of intention. And I think you can also get a picture of intention when you look at war finance, especially early on in the war. So I'll flag that. Okay, my slide went ahead of me, which is fine because we're on a time crunch. So let me just give you the bottom line for Ukraine up front. This is going to be a war financed almost entirely by foreign grants and loans. If Ukraine does not have access to foreign, I mostly mean Western funds and material, it's not going to support the military, its war effort, or the population that has remained. Taxes are just not going to be part of this conversation. I suspect administrative capacity is on or near at a standstill. So the ability to collect and process revenue with large swaths of the country under attack is going to be incredibly difficult. And we're seeing, as was mentioned, about 1 million refugees already and more leaving, right? So we have no sales tax income coming in. Your corporate and income taxes are not going to be coming in. And that all even assumes relevant bureaucracies are able to collect and process revenue. And if the capital moves, which is possible, can even experience administrators follow. So tax revenue is going to be off the table. So what about domestic debt? This is going to be incredibly difficult for Ukraine. It was a budding domestic market for its debt prior to the war, with a fairly small investor base comprised mostly of state and commercial banks, whose funds were assets by corporations and households. So these are short-term deposits where, we're often Western biased with these large, deep markets for US debt that are basically insatiable. That's not the case here. So absent pension funds and insurance companies, there's no demand for medium and long-term securities. And in the past couple of years, the Ukrainian economy has been looking to expand its foreign investor base. So it's, again, a young market, and it's been working with the IMF, World Bank, EU, and the US to make its debt more sustainable. A couple days ago, there was an announcement of a war bond campaign. From what I know, I think it's domestic targeted, but I am not sure yet. On Monday, it raised 8.1, that should, I think, billion in local currency, $273 million. What I saw was that there's going to be a yield of 11% with a tenure of 1 year. 11% is very expensive. You don't want an interest rate of 11%, right? US, our debt's at what, 1%? So that's cheap. This is expensive. And 11% with a 1 year to pay back is even more expensive. So you want to see and keep an eye out for these rates to go down. That's a good sign for the Ukrainian economy, and then to have longer payback periods. But it is in local currency, so that'll be much easier for the government to pay back. So it's a very high goal. We'll see if there's more to come on this front, but this will be a very small proportion of the total Ukrainian war finance effort. And most of what is going to be coming from is from abroad. Sorry, my slides went too fast. It's from abroad, and that's going to be the direct transfer of material to Ukraine. This is going to be ideal, but this ensures the material that the Ukrainians needed and a logistics supply line that is continuously and successfully kept open. Some things that I was doing these slides came off the top of my head, thinking about Lend-Lease in Burma, and the Burma Road for the Burma campaign, Yom Kippur War, Operation Nickel Glass, with the United States using a huge airlift campaign to Israel. So these big productions with secure supply lines are going to be ideal for Ukraine, because it's going to take time off the table. Ukraine is, they're just trying to survive here. You don't want to spend time negotiating the sale of equipment. You don't want to worrying about what currency are you going to pay this equipment in, because you're going to have balance of payments problems for them. So it's just about getting as much material continuously into Ukraine from various Western countries. And this, what we're seeing, the volume of material within 1 week, the speed and the number of countries is unprecedented. I have never seen anything like this. You know, it has a very Lend-Lease vibe, but it took FDR a year to sell that to Congress, a year. And throughout that period, it was just, have the Europeans, have these countries suffered enough? Are they really giving it their all? That's not even on the table right now. We'll see what gets passed from a US perspective. This coming up with Congress right now as more Ukraine aid goes up. But what we're seeing is a lot of flows very quickly. This is a quick accounting, 17 states and counting that I've seen. Japanese have guaranteed loans. There's humanitarian aid coming in from various states. The IMF and the World Bank are all coming with emergency packages and financing for Ukraine. So there is a lot of support. What stood out to me, again, flagging something new, is the European Union. For the first time ever, the EU is financing as a body, again, don't know why my slide's going so fast, as a body, the purchase and delivery of weapons. This is a big support package, 450 million euros with 50 million more in non-lethal supplies. And this has already been authorized, part of the European Peace Facility Financing Instrument. It's a subcomponent of the European Defense Funds. They don't require member states to vote on these. This is just money. They did meet and give a formal nod, but is no requirement. This is under EU authority. And if this is end up being funded by Eurobonds and the mechanisms and the authorities are in place for that to happen, this fund could grow substantially. So the EU entering the war finance game has a lot of potential here to grow. Other thing that was new was global finance. There's a bank account for anyone who wants to donate money directly to the National Bank of Ukraine to finance the Ukrainian war effort. And anyone from around the world can donate. And what fascinates me about this is I say it flippantly and I don't mean it to be, but I can sit on my couch in my pajamas on a Saturday afternoon and get money to the Ukrainian military immediately. And so that is something that's new that I've never seen before. We've definitely had donation campaigns, diaspora campaigns, but not instantaneous with global reach with the speed that we're having it. So the takeaways for the Ukraine: to be successful, this is going to be a war effort paid by the West for the foreseeable future, and this can and will get more costly. So it's really the West's decision to sustain the Ukrainian war finance effort. EU is a new global player, notable global reach and speed, and the West would be best served as starting to coordinate. If this conflict is going to endure, Ukraine needs to get, what it needs on the table and a list. And so I don't know why my slides don't like me. My hands are even in the air. I'm not doing it. And they're going to need to coordinate material moving forward. So Russia. Again, going to fight the war, you finance the war you think you're going to fight. It looks like, from our financial perspectives, the thought was this going to be a short war. And I don't imagine the wave of global sanctions was going to come down upon them was expected. I did not expect that. Often there's a lot of talk we see about this war chest of financial reserves, but that is really going to be on pause. So a long war for them is going to be incredibly hard to finance. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so these war chests, as they say, is really a strategic buffer for the economy. and not just to spend on the war. So we think of war chest as these idle reserves sitting in some bank account to be used on a rainy day. It's not that easy. That money is really used to prop up the value of the ruble by selling dollars and euros, right? You want to stabilize the ruble, stabilize your economy. You want to provide relief for importers and exports and show investors that, you know, we're going to do business as usual. And that money is now, if what can be used, which it can't, would have been used towards that. And so because of these sanctions, the Russian central bank doesn't have access to sell the dollars and the euros that it has to buy rubles. So it's basically frozen. And these reserves are also tied up in other ways, petrodollars for purchasing. So it's not just a war chest that Putin can tap on and off as a hose and have access to. Okay, well, let's go briefly these other forms of war finance if this conflict continues. I got to be honest, I don't think taxes are going to be a part of the game here. You don't want taxes to draw attention to an unpopular war. And given the nature of the Russian economy, I can't imagine this would be very popular. And it would also signal you're going to need a lot of revenue for a long time. And I suspect the short war narrative is going to continue. So it's very, very doubtful. Domestic debt. Well, that's going to be costly. The Russian central bank doubled interest rates to 20%. So think, right? I just said the Ukrainians are expensive debt at 11%. Now think of 20% and paying that back. So that's going to be incredibly costly. Foreign debt. Well, that's going to be pretty much off the market. There's no access to Western markets. Their downgraded credit rating, I think, is now junk bond status. So that's going to be expensive and difficult. Oil revenue is still coming in. So Yuval mentioned that could be frozen. I saw that Pakistan agreed to import wheat and material. So there's ways to help the economy that way. But that could be frozen. Expropriation of resources, sure, you could seize foreign assets, but that's not going to yield you enough to continue this. China has been the big question we've been looking at. The mechanisms are in place for China to aid Russia here. After 2014, they set up swap lines. A small Chinese version of SWIFT, the cross-border interbank payment system, has institutions it can tap into. So that's been kind of where we've been looking. But as was mentioned, and it's here, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank suspended activities related to Russia and Belarus, which is a signal that China is not going to be coming to the economic rescue or provide the foreign aid and loans to help fund this war effort. So both sides overall, to sum up, are going to have war financing challenges. And I think Russia needs a quick war. Whatever that is, quick in quotes. I saw somewhere, 15 days was the plan. But it's going to need a quick war if it's going to be successful on the war finance front. And Ukraine may be in a better position economically if the West continues to support the Ukrainian economy and war effort to endure. And again, the speed and intensity by which foreign actors have come into war finance has been novel. And so I'll stop there and we can just go to Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And to everyone in the audience, go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat. I've already got a couple, so I'm just going to start getting into them and teeing them up for the both of you. So first one from Colonel Menke, and it was directed at Dr. Weber, but I think you can both cover it since there's an economic aspect. He's asking, can you expand further on what the average Russian would be experiencing economically right about now and feeling personally about the war? And with that, I'd add another question is, in terms of the personal feelings, is there any kind of unified personal response, or is there still possibly some divergent opinions in Russia in terms of support for and against Putin in the war?
Well, thank you, Colonel Menke, Major Brown. Those are big questions. Obviously, so let me sort of disaggregate those to the best way that I can. When it comes to what is the economic reaction, it is quite clear to every single person in Russia that whatever is about to happen or whatever has happened, this is the big one. Like, things are falling apart. The reason for that is Russia has lived through already in basically modern history 2 full economic collapses. One in basically right after the Soviet Union came to an end, and another in 1998. And in both of those, sort of one of the proxies that people can remember is basically the collapse of the ruble. And so because Russians, when they think about their own currency, they think about obviously like, how much does it cost to buy, stuff at the store, but always in terms of foreign exchange. Anyone who's ever been to Moscow will tell you on almost every single street in the capital, there is like a currency exchange place. People have been hedging currency for years, decades at this point. The psychological, the psychological effect, trauma of seeing the ruble lose 40, 50% in a week, going above like the limit of 100 rubles to the dollar, this is the destruction. That is something that cannot be explained away in any meaningful sense. So therefore, how do people think about the war? First of all, there's no war. It's a special military operation. A war, that involves essentially like 2 nation states going at it. Since Ukraine is not a nation state, but basically a criminal regime that is terrorizing and holding hostage, the good and lovely people of Ukraine, you can't fight war against these people. You have a special military operation to remove that leadership. So because they can't call it a war, they can't get into the realm of, what do you think about war? Obviously, every person who doesn't want basically their own society to fall apart, as well as people who are shocked by what is happening, are against the war. And in fact, today, we think about elite splintering as one of the first signs of, is there going to be a coup? Like, what's going on? The head of Russia's second largest oil company and largest private oil company, called Lukoil. His name is Vagit Alekperov, who's been in charge of this oil company since like the early 1990s. So he's a pretty savvy political operator. He was the first person to say that the war, and use the word war, must stop. His company lost 99.2% of its value in the past week, and he personally lost, in terms of his wealth, $6.9 billion. So people who understand the way the world works are in complete disarray. Average people are like, what is going on? I did not expect this. I was not psychologically prepared for this. And the speaker of the parliament today, the speaker of the Russian parliament, this guy named Volodin, the Ministry of Education had a nationwide teach-in on TV, which is insane to me, where he said in an interview, for this thing, is that if we had not gone in literally that day, the very next day, NATO had planned the invasion of Russia through Ukraine, and we were afraid of nuclear catastrophe. That's basically the story that they need people to believe. And Major Brown, what was the the last question?
That was whether there was any indications of strong divergent opinions in terms of being for or against the war operation, or supporting Putin directly.
So there have been numerous reports, from yesterday, as I mentioned, that martial law might be imposed tomorrow. Martial law would not be imposed if the operation had gone well. Martial law would not be imposed if the people were united and knew what was going on. Introducing military censorship, closing the borders, having a general mobilization. These are pretty real things that indicate things have gone very, very badly, and it is a total emergency. And at that point, there's not going to be any person who can't understand that something has gone terribly awry. Over.
All right, thanks. Dr. Zielinski, anything to add?
No, but I would say, I think don't underestimate psychological trauma in relation to your economy. I think it's one of the biggest things that needs to be managed if I'm Russia moving forward, is thinking about that, because in various wars, we often just focus with war finance on the war itself. Someone put in a comment, it just went through very quickly, of center of gravity and a citizen's ability to just manage their daily lives. in both economies is going to be incredibly important. So I would not discount that as incredibly important to shaping this and these narratives in this conflict.
All right, thank you. And there's another question here, sort of going back to the Russian populace. I'll weave in here in a second, but next one up was from Lieutenant Colonel Kobek out of the Krulak Center here. And Dr. Weber, since you already sort of mentioned Russia is saying that Ukraine and NATO were threatening nuclear activity, Putin himself has been throwing the word nuclear around more than once. What do you think is the likelihood that he actually feels that this option is viable or necessary for him at this point?
Well, I mean, in this situation, it would be if there's no place for Russia in the world, there's no use for this world altogether. Just sort of anger and spite. When a man under tremendous pressure, facing a losing war in a bunker, has some history to that. So, like in that situation, maybe, but otherwise, they had raised basically the nuclear card at the beginning in order to deter the United States or NATO from intervening directly into the conflict. The United States, NATO has explicitly from the get-go said that like U.S. or NATO troops would not be going in, and so I would imagine that even for Putin and the people around him, the idea that you would nuke Ukraine or basically European capitals or Washington or whatever because you're losing the war, that might be the very last reality check. So I don't want to say cautiously optimistic, but it seems more far-fetched the further we get into this.
Okay, thank you. All right, so a couple questions here. I'll try and wrap together. Dr. Cappella, Zielinski, you already mentioned sort of the centers of gravity and points of weakness. So I guess first of all, in terms of points of weakness on the activity taken against the Russian economy, is there anything that, Dr. Weber, you kind of had a pretty extensive list there, but is there anything left that could be done that has not been done yet to sort of go after any remaining financial weaknesses? And then, I guess to both of you, centers of gravity, on the flip side, what do Russia and Ukraine still have going for them in terms of seeking a favorable outcome from their perspective in this war?
Well, I mean, I think one thing I wanted to also follow up with is, Russia's ability to manage its economy. It's like getting your feet taken out from under you. If the central bank can't act, its ability to manage all of these economic dislocations are going to be near impossible. Managing, inflation, disinflation, all these levers that you have that we rely on central banks so much. So just freezing all of these assets and hampering the central bank, because central banks have to make a choice of what they want to value. And right now they're still trying to signal to investors. So I really think that we've done so much in terms of the West. I don't want to say the West has done so much. I know Biden, right before we got on this call, released new sanctions targeted to individuals. So I don't know what else is in their pocket. But as these continue to work their way through the system, even over the next couple of days, I think I would say let's take a second to see what else we have to throw at them first, and see where the economy goes to see what's next beyond targeted individuals. But oil is really what's left. And that has obviously huge ramifications for various European economies and the American economy.
Okay, and actually, with that, I'm going to throw something else in here. We just got a question. If you could maybe expand on the impact of an oil stoppage going into the EU, especially in terms of Russian exports, and then also, given, I think as you all said, we're in like uncharted territory here, but the way a modern economy is structured, how long can Russia have any semblance of an economy if these sanctions are kept in place in the long term?
So if I can just answer that question, build off or Dr. Cappella Zielinski just said is to think, just yesterday, for example, there were more sanctions on Russia's, basically all the refining companies and basically Russia's refining capacity. That is a key way of like, how does Russia like go up the value chain? They're going after that. The thing about sort of like all the different sanctions, and let me just get to, in a sense, as Dr. Cappella Zielinski just said, like they're going after the oil and gas exports next. Like intermediaries, oil traders are not buying Russian oil. Surgutneftegaz, which is one of the big Russian companies, had for 4 days in a row tried to sell their oil through regular tender and could not get buyers. So we're actually having, through basically the uncoordinated, but clearly everyone's in the same information environment, private market actors are not buying Russian oil because, one, how are they going? So even though they can pay, like President Biden and the Europeans made an exception for it, who wants to basically go through the hassle of getting the financial surveillance of the entire universe on you? If you can't do it for whatever reason, do you want to open up an escrow account for basically a Russian buyer? You start to get into all these things in which literally every single risk and compliance lawyer in the universe is telling you, no matter how much they offer as a discount, I will charge you more to walk you through this. So we have that sense that we have basically this shadow sanction on oil exports. And when we're thinking about where can it go in terms of sanctions, as of yesterday and again today, the anti-Putin coalition, the sanctions coalition, is applying everything that's going to Russia onto Belarus. Belarus is a much smaller, much poorer country, and they were only able to, their leader, Lukashenko, was only able to withstand force through a lot of coercion and introduction of Russian military assets. So in fact, so we can see Belarus is the bellwether for Russia. Belarus, way smaller, far, far poorer than Russia. If they get full blocking sanctions on their banks, their potash, their steel, their lumber all gets sanctioned, they're going to run out of money much more quickly, and that becomes the preview of what's going to happen to Russia. Revolution, coup, basically breakdown of social order, it'll happen to Belarus first.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and just get through these questions here as fast as I can because I know both of you have commitments here shortly. So next from Scott Erzlatz at MCU here, and kind of building off of your, talking about the information environment. He mentions the Ukrainians seem to have been intentionally targeting not just the Russian populace, but Russian mothers with their IO campaign. Everything from having prisoners of war calling them up to I think posting pictures of deceased soldiers on the battlefield saying, "Hey, these are your sons. Identify them, and we'll send them back to you." And I think I saw today as well that there were talks of like we'll release prisoners to the mothers directly at the border. So, is this a lever of power of some point that could generate that groundswell to have an impact on Putin's decision making for continuing the war?
So it's been clear that the soldiers themselves, given the consistency of the stories they've told, and they're basically their prisoner of war videos where they explain how they got there, is that they did not know they were about to face combat, like in being the term, like, here's your mobilization, here's what we're doing the next, 72 hours. They did not know they were going to Ukraine. They just thought they were in exercises basically indefinitely. So they weren't able to tell their parents, the goodbyes or like, I might be in trouble or I might be in danger, etc. So the people who have sent their sons, brothers, husbands don't know where they are. So what the Ukrainians have done is, and this is really like one of the major sea changes that we'll see in conflict, because everyone in the world basically is now on social media. They find, Ivan Ivanov, and they're actually able to see, like, where are you from? Like, I'm from Kemerovo or whatever other town. They'll find that guy on Russia's version of Facebook and start to message his friends. Your friend is safe, but he's a prisoner of war. They contact people's parents directly. They, because like obviously everyone like has cell phones, they're calling people directly. And so the person-to-person aspect via social media and essentially then advertising that, across, the entire universe, showing, how well they treat these prisoners of war is unprecedented. And of course, what it does is it pierces the information veil within Russia, because people now know my husband, my brother, my son is actually in Ukraine, and he's a prisoner. How can he be a prisoner of a special military operation because prisoners are only taken during war? And that's what starts it up. And even today, people were posting in Russia that they got, those like spam calls from Ukrainian numbers, and the recording was Volodymyr Zielinski saying, obviously in Russian, "I'm Volodymyr Zielinski, president of Ukraine. My country has never attacked yours. Please bring your sons home." And that as like an IO campaign in terms of getting access to the Russian cell phone networks. So I'll just stop here by saying what the Russians thought is because they had a successful special operation in Crimea, they could basically just do the same thing across an entire country. That country understands the culture of the adversary and is willing to and is able to meet it at that informational level. And as the Russian basically messaging has been corrupted and discredited, that's how essentially the Ukrainians are able to take and reverse it back against the Russians. Thank you. Over.
All right, thanks, Dr. Weber. So I'm looking at the clock, and I think I'm going to have to stop the questions there. My apologies. But I want to have at least a couple of seconds here to let both of our guests have any closing comments before we say farewell, and we'll talk about who's coming up next on the Brewcast series. So over to both of you for your final thoughts.
Sure. I think final thoughts to me is thinking about the role of time. I don't ever want to say time is on one side or the other. I've never seen, from a war finance perspective, a country in such economic shambles that it chooses to not continue a war effort. It just is going to change their calculus and their ability to continue to the war effort and how effective or efficient they are. So I think we're at an inflection point of if this is conflict's going to endure and stabilize. I think the tipping point is going to go to the Ukrainians. I think. Again, I don't want to be a prognosticator, but that's my instinct and reaction, especially everything we've talked about today with the Russian economy. But overall, as Yuval just did with the mind blown, everything about this, there's so many new components that we're seeing in this global economy that are just fascinating to watch and to continue to see as we learn ongoing in real time. Thank you for having me.
Yes, again, thank you, Dr. Cappella Zielinski. Thank you to all the people who came today. And, let me just say the same thing about time. There's basically the race against time is there's the old saw, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Here we are. Who rearms first? That's basically one main issue. And what collapses first? The Russian government or the Russian people? And so that's basically the two big questions. Like, we don't know if Russia can rearm first, Ukraine can rearm first, or what happens in terms of Russian domestic society. That tells not Putin, because he gave a televised address today that would have been insane like a week ago. In the current environment, this was, I don't want to use, a certain person from mid-40s Germany. Don't want to use that name. But in terms of the break from reality, it was not good. Him versus society, that's the question of time. Out.
All right. Well, to both Dr. Yuval Weber, Dr. Rosella Cappella Zielinski, thank you again both very much for coming on here. I'm going to have this posted as quick as I can, so the rest of anyone who couldn't dial in today can get the benefit of your perspectives in short order. So for everyone else in the audience, as always, thank you for coming. Working on the final time. So right now, the next couple of folks who are going to be looking at Russia and Ukraine for us are coming Sunday evening. We're going to have Major General Mick Ryan, newly retired from the Australian Army. About a week before the war started, he wrote a book called War Transformed. And so we're getting, and in the meantime, he's been doing a lot of kind of analysis on social media about what he's seeing. So we're going to talk to him about both those things, sort of, you know, kind of how he wrote the book and then the war happened. So we'll sort of see what he's seen about war transformed in the 21st century in a 21st century battlefield as it unfolds. And then next Friday morning, we're going to have Matthew Ford, Andrew Hoskins, and our new visiting fellow from Swedish Defense University at the Krulak Center, Henrik Paulson, talking, focusing more on the information domain in this war, because obviously that's been a massive part of the campaign, especially on the Ukrainian side. For everyone in the audience, getting questions about the slides, those will be posted when I put this thing up on our social media channels as well. So you'll get access to all that stuff once I get it edited and done, which I will try and do today. So again, thank you all. Have a good day, and we'll see you on the next one.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.